Hello and welcome to Beyond the Things Written. Today, we're beginning our year by year history of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's called The Light Gets Brighter and Brighter Until You Can't See. Chapter 1, Part 1. William Miller and the Clock That Kept Ticking. In the spring of 1844, a farmer in western New York stood at the edge of his field and considered a question that farmers do not usually have to ask: whether there was any point in planting. Seed cost money, plowing costs weeks. The harvest would come in October, and according to a calculation he trusted, a calculation built from the book of Daniel, checked and rechecked by men he considered careful students of scriptures, the world was not expected to make it to October. He was no fool. He was not a fanatic. By the standard of his neighbors, he may have been the most biblically literate man in his township. He had simply accepted an answer to a math problem. This history is, in large part, about the math problem, where it came from, how it was assembled, why intelligent and sincere people kept trusting it after it failed, and how that failure themselves were eventually converted into evidence. Before this chapter is over, we will watch the farmer's deadline arrive. But to understand why he's standing at the edge of the field, we have to go back and watch the clock being built. Now, William Miller was not the first man to wind this clock. For the purpose of this history, Miller is not the inventor of prophetic chronology. He is the man who made one American version of it tick loudly enough that the whole communities began setting their lives by it. William Miller did not invent the practice of calculating the end of the world from biblical prophecy. Christians have been attempting that for centuries, generally with considerable more confidence before the date than afterward. And by the time Miller began preaching, much of the machinery was already running. One example makes the point almost too well. In 1823, more than 20 years before the Great Disappointment, an English prophetic writer named J.A. Brown, usually identified as John Aquila Brown, published The Eventide, or Last Triumph. Miller, Barber, Russell, and Rutherford. It feels strangely familiar. The toolbox is already on the bench. Daniel, Revelation, year-day calculations, the trampling of Jerusalem, the restoration of Israel, the fall of the Gentile empires, the Ottoman or Islamic powers as an obstacle to prophecy, and a cascade of dates marching confidently across the 19th and early 20th centuries. Brown's title page is almost a prophecy chart in miniature. He says that the work develops the mysteries of Daniel and St. John and the prophecies concerning the renovated kingdom of Israel. Then he lists the periods he intends to trace and solve: 240, 391, 1260, 1290, 1335, 2300, and 2520. Now, these dates here, 1260, 1290, 1335, 2300, 2520, those are the main ones to remember. Now, this is not a casual devotional exercise. That is a man walking into Daniel's clock shop and asking whether anything comes in apocalyptic walnut. The dates are just striking. Brown looks to 1844 for the rise of the Jewish kingdom and the destruction of the papal power. He looked to 1873 for the seventh vial and the extirpation of Islam. He looked to 1917 for the triumphant glory of Israel and the close of the Last Judgment. Elsewhere in the argument, he uses Jubilee reasonings, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian supremacy, and the 2,520 years to connect the rise of the Gentile monarchies with their final dissolution. Before Miller became famous in America, a British prophetic writer was already combining Israel, Jerusalem, Gentile rule, world empires, Islam, Daniel's time periods, and the terminal dates into one large system. Now, that does not prove that Miller, Barber, and Russell had Brown open on the desk. History rarely gives us neat little receipts. Brown proves something just as important here. These ideas were already available in the religious atmosphere. Later interpreters did not need to copy him directly. They were drinking from the same prophetic well. Later Adventist history even noticed the overlap. Isaac C. Walcomb's History of the Second Advent Message says Brown's assigning 1873 as the termination of the 2300 days of Daniel, beginning the period with Nehemiah's second visit to Jerusalem, which Brown placed in 428 BC. Walcombe then adds that N.H. Barber later terminated his own argument at the same point, though by a different mode of reckoning. So they're just coming up randomly, just landing on dates, and even with completely different methods. Now, this is not direct line of dependency, but it's a very useful warning. The dates and methods that later surfaced around Barber and Russell were not dropping from heaven in the 1870s. They had a prehistory. So Miller remains central to the story, but in a more precise way. He did not create prophetic culture from nothing. He became the American organizer and popularizer of one version of it. The pieces were already circulating around the Atlantic. Miller gathered them, systematized them, preached them, and gave them a movement. But Miller set in motion the particular American chain of interpretations that leads directly into this history. From Millerism to the scattered Adventist movements, from those movements to Nelson Barber, from Barber to Charles Taze Russell, and from Russell into the Watchtower movement, and eventually Jehovah's Witnesses. The connection is not merely that larger groups also believe the end was near. In Miller, we can see the prophetic machinery become a mass movement, find symbolic numbers in scriptures, convert prophetic dates into calendar years, choose a historical starting point, calculate an ending, and then read wars, revolutions, religious movements, and political crises as signs that the calculation is being confirmed. But we should be careful. Miller himself did not hand down the whole later repair strategy. He expected a visible, earthly, apocalyptic return of Christ. The move of preserving a failed date by relocating the events to heaven or into an invisible sphere belongs especially to post-1844 Millerite and Adventist survivors. So no, Miller did not build the clock from scratch. Brown shows that many of the gears were already on the table. But Miller assembled one American version with enough force and urgency that later men inherited a very useful question. What do you do when the clock strikes and the world keeps going? Now, just a warning before we continue. These opening episodes of the history of Jehovah's Witnesses is going to be a little more chronological than some of the later history episodes. Set the tone of kind of what's going on. And eventually, I'm sure a lot of it will just sink in. To understand why such dates as 1874, 1878, 1881, and 1914 could later sound persuasive, we have to watch the original machinery being assembled at least once. You don't need to memorize every cog. Notice the pattern, symbolic number, historic starting point, calculating ending, urgent expectation, later repair. So we ask why Miller belongs in history of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, William Miller never called himself a Jehovah's Witness. He died in 1849, 3 decades before the first issue of Zion's Watchtower, and more than 80 years before Ruther adopted the name Jehovah's Witnesses. He did not found the Watchtower Society, and many doctrines later associated with Russell's were not his. The line is nevertheless direct. Miller's preaching produced the Millerite movement. After the failure of 1844, the movement fractured into Adventist bodies that retained different portions of his prophetic system. Nelson Barber passed through that world as a young man, rebuilt its chronology, and later taught Charles Russell the invisible presence of Christ and the timetable that would make 1914 central to Watchtower history, or at least later on. Russell did not discover the prophetic calendar alone in a room with an open Bible. He inherited a repaired Millerite clock. It had already stopped more than once, but the owners remained very attached to it. Miller therefore matters because much of the machinery becomes a movement through him. Prophecy, the year-to-year principle, interlocking calculations, end-time urgency, current events treated as fulfillment, a small but crucial habit of treating a conclusion as obvious once the calculations have been arranged to produce it. Now, William Miller was born February 15th, 1782, in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and grew up in Lowhampton, New York, near the Vermont border. He was largely self-educated, widely read, and had a methodical temperament. As a young man, he moved toward deism. He believed in God, but doubted that the Bible formed a coherent supernatural revelation. Around 1816, Miller returned to Baptist Christianity. He later presented his change as an intellectual and spiritual crisis resolved through Scripture. Once convinced that the Bible was trustworthy, he approached it with the same determination he had brought to his doubts. Miller described reading the Bible from Genesis onward, verse by verse, refusing to move forward until a passage made sense. He used a concordance and allowed one biblical passage to interpret another. The method sounded admirably independent. No creed, clergy, and only a man and his Bible. But no reader arrives without inherited assumptions. Miller worked inside Protestant historicism, Daniel and Revelation as a map of history, beasts as empires, the papacy as antichrist, and prophetic days as years. He read alone, perhaps, but he did not think alone. The room was crowded with people who had been dead for centuries. He said, "I was thus brought, in 1818, at the close of my 2 years' study of the Scriptures, to a solemn conclusion that in about 25 years from that time, all the affairs of our present state will be wound up." 25 years from 1818 brought him to approximately 1843. The clock had started. Now, it would not be the last prophetic clock in this story. It was simply the first one we meet with this much confidence and no visible warranty. Now, what Miller believed would happen. Before getting lost in arithmetic, we should be clear about the events Miller expected. He did not originally predict an invisible presence, an invisible inspection, or a change known only to angels and people with very patient charge. He expected the literal, personal, visible return of Jesus Christ and the end of the present order. Scriptures he used, Acts 1:11, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking at the sky? This Jesus who was taken up into the sky will come in the same manner as you see him going into the sky. 1 Thessalonians 4:16, about Jesus descending with the archangel's voice and being gathered. And 2 Peter 3:10, but Jehovah's day will come as a thief, in which heaven will pass away with a roar, but the elements, being intensely hot, will be dissolved. Earth and the works in it will be exposed. Miller joined such passages in Daniel's periods. When the 7 times ended, he said God's people would be gathered, the kingdom given to the saints, Babylon destroyed by the brightness of his coming, and sin and suffering brought to an end for all those awaiting him. He said, the people of God will be gathered from all nations, and the kingdoms of the greatness of the kingdom will be given to the saints of the Most High. Mystical Babylon will be destroyed by the brightness of his coming, and sin, suffering for sin, will be finished in those who look for his coming. Now this matters because the later heavenly reinterpretations was not a minor correction to the same predictions. The original claim was public, earthly, and testable. Jesus would return. The dead would rise. The world would be judged. A person would not need a denominational explanation several years later to discover whether it had occurred. Now, of course, this pattern will be repeated. Now, the rule that enlarged the numbers. Miller's chronologically depended upon a year-to-day principle. One prophetic day represented one literal year. 2 passages supplied the standard Bible warrant. Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. Basically, a day for a year, a day for a year. In both passages, however, the symbolic relationship is implicitly signed for a particular action. In Numbers, 40 days of spying corresponds to 40 years of punishment. In Ezekiel, the prophet lies on his side for a stated number of days to symbolize years of guilt. Neither passage announces a universal rule requiring every number in apocalyptic prophecy to be expanded by 365 times. Of course, that's what apocalypticists do. Now, historicist interpreters nevertheless treated this relationship as a general key. Daniel's 1260 days became 1260 years. 7 prophetic years became 2,520 years. The 2300 evenings and mornings become 2300 years. Once a day could become a year, a short ancient crisis could stretch conveniently across empire and arrive at the interpreter's front door. The year-day principle did not by itself create 1843. It merely enlarged the canvas. Miller still had to decide which periods belonged together, which each began, which historical events counted, and what the ending meant. This is where interpretation begins doing the work, while arithmetic receives the applause. Once a prophetic day becomes a year, even the word soon can acquire a remarkably generous timetable. Now, what was his master calculation? Daniel's 2,300 days. This is kind of his whole crux, really. The foundation of Miller's system was Daniel 8:13 and 14. Daniel hears a question about the duration of the daily sacrifice, the desolating transgression, and the trampling of the sanctuary and hosts. Daniel 8:13, 14. How long will the vision of the constant feature and of the transgression causing desolation continue? To make both the holy place and the army things to trample on, until 2,300 evenings and mornings, and the holy place will certainly be restored to its right condition. Miller read 2,300 days as 2,300 years. But Daniel 8 supplied no calendar date for which Miller could begin counting. He joined Daniel 8 to the 70 weeks of Daniel 9. Daniel 9:24-26 reads, There are 70 weeks that have been determined for your people and your holy city, from the issuing of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah, the leader. There will be 7 weeks, also 62 weeks. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off with nothing for him. The 70 weeks were underscored as 70 weeks of years, 70 multiplied by 7 or 490 years. Miller dated the decree to restore Jerusalem to the 7th year of Artaxerxes, associated with Ezra 7 in 457 BCE. He believed 490 years reached to the death of Christ, and he used Ezra 7, 11, 13. Then came the decisive assumption. The 70 weeks were the first 490 years of the 2,300 years. Daniel does not say that. Two visions share themes and vocabulary, but the text never states that the periods begin together. Miller joined them because the shorter period supplied the missing starting point for the longer one. So we have the 2,300 years, total period from Daniel 8, minus the 490 years, 70 years to the Messiah. Then we have the 1,810 years remaining after the 70 weeks, plus 33 years from the date of Christ's death. So that gives us 1,843 CE. So he says, Then I inquired if 490 years of the 2,300 was fulfilled when our Savior was crucified. How much of the vision remained after his death? I answered, 1,810 years. I then inquired what year after his birth that would be, and the answer was the year 1843. Now, that was the master clock. Hanging on the center of the wall, everything else in the system gets arranged around it. Miller considered this calculation so secure that he challenged others to find the failure. He had studied the matter for some 17 years, he said, and still could not discover where the system broke. He once said, I then beg the privilege, and do now, for any person to show me any failure of proof on this point, or where possibly, according to Scriptures, that there may be a failure in the calculation. I have not, yet by 17 years' study, been able to discover where I might fail. Sounds confident. It also shifts the burden into a slightly obnoxious way. Miller had made the prediction. Now the world was being asked to disprove the machinery behind it. But a public prediction of Christ's return does not need an expert committee to refute it. Time would do enough proving of its own. If Christ returned, Miller would be vindicated. If the year passed and the world continued, the challenge answered itself. And that is where part 1 leaves us, with the date built, the confidence high, and the clock running. Coming in part 2, this will show what happens when Miller starts hanging clocks on every wall in the house. Once the 2,300 days are fastened to 1843, other passages begin to fall into place around it. Leviticus becomes 2,520 years. Daniel's 1260, 1290, and 1335 days are arranged around church history and modern events. The number 666 receives a date. Even Jesus' parable begin to look, in Miller's hands, like a coded map of 19th century America. In other words, the next chapter is where the calculations become a system. Once the system exists, later believers will inherit not just one failed date, but an entire method for turning failure into further proof.